The wind carried dust through the narrow street of the frontier town, whistling against the wooden shutters that clung stubbornly to old saloons and trading posts. Horses shifted uneasily at the hitching rails, sensing the unease in the air, their ears flicking back at the sound of voices rising and falling like the desert wind. Folks had gathered, eyes fixed on the center of the street, where one figure stood alone, proud and unyielding. She was a woman who had never belonged to anyone, nor to any law but her own. Her wild spirit was as fierce as the untamed land around her, and no man in town had dared to lay claim to her. Some whispered she was a curse. Others said she was blessed by the desert itself. Whatever the truth, she carried herself with a fire that no rope, no ring, and no promise could ever hold. Her eyes burned with defiance, her skin marked with sun and earth, as if carved from the land itself. Men had tried, and men had failed. Some rode in with gold, others with guns, and a few with tender words. All left defeated, their pride shattered, their ambitions turned to dust under her sharp tongue and sharper stare. She was the kind of woman mothers warned their sons about, the kind who could not be tamed by promises of comfort or cages of silver. And yet, despite all the warnings, men still tried. But on this day, the air was different. A silence hung heavier than the heat, as if even the desert paused to listen. From the far edge of town, a rider approached, his horse dark and scarred, his posture unshaken despite the long miles. He wore no badge, no uniform of any army, no mark of a lawman. His chest bore the marks of old battles, his face shadowed by lines that spoke of hardship and fire. Most striking of all was the scar that cut deep across his cheek, a mark that seemed carved not just into his skin, but into his very soul. The townsfolk recognized him even before he drew close enough to be seen clearly. Whispers rippled through the crowd like dry leaves in the wind. Apache, they said he had walked away from his people. That he had once fought both bluecoats and graycoats alike. That his hands had carried more blood than the Colorado River itself. No one knew his full story, but all agreed on one thing: where he went, trouble followed. And now his dark eyes were fixed on the woman no man dared to claim. She did not flinch when he rode in. She stood firm, her hands at her sides, her shoulders squared like the cliffs rising over the desert canyons. The scarred Apache dismounted without a word, his boots striking the dust with a weight that seemed to shake the earth. He stepped toward her, slow and measured, his gaze unbroken. The men who had once tried to tame her shifted uncomfortably at the edges of the crowd. Some clenched their fists, others rested hands on their gun belts, though none dared move. They had challenged her before, but this was different. This was a storm walking on two legs. The Apache was not just another man. He was the shadow of the old ways, a reminder of battles fought and lost. The woman tilted her chin upward, meeting his stare with a fire of her own. The distance between them narrowed until only a breath of air remained. Neither spoke. The silence was louder than gunfire. Around them, the town seemed to vanish. The murmurs of the crowd, the creak of saddles, even the rustling of the wind faded away. For years, no one had dared claim her. For years, she had stood untamed, unyielding, a force of nature that belonged to no one. Yet now, with this scarred warrior standing before her, something shifted. The townsfolk felt it too, an invisible current that swept through the street. It was not submission nor surrender, but a challenge that burned between them, fierce and unspoken. A child tugged at his mother's dress, asking in a whisper who would win. The mother hushed him quickly, her eyes never leaving the pair in the center. Old men spat into the dust, muttering that nothing good could come of this. The barkeep leaned on his doorframe, holding his breath as though waiting for a gunfight. The Apache finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying more weight than any shout. Yet the words were not for the crowd. They were for her alone. The woman's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not of kindness, but of defiance. As if daring him to try what others had failed, the scarred warrior took one more step closer. Close enough that the dust of his journey clung to her skin. She did not back away. She did not bow. The desert sun burned overhead, and still they stood locked in that moment. Two storms about to collide, and as the town held its breath, no one could tell if what came next would be fire or ruin. The story had only just begun, and the desert was hungry to bear witness. The air in the street thickened like smoke, though no fire burned. The Apache and the untamable woman stood face to face, neither moving, neither giving the other even the smallest advantage. Behind them, the townsfolk shifted restlessly, their voices low and cautious. It was not every day they saw two such forces of will meet in the center of their dusty little town. Some wanted to step forward, to interfere, to speak reason, but something in their bones told them to stay silent. The desert had rules of its own, rules older than law books and sheriffs, and this moment belonged to it alone. She had lived long enough in the shadows of the West to know what men thought when they looked at her. They saw beauty shaped by the sun and strength built from surviving harsher things than hunger. They saw pride, they saw freedom, and they wanted to own it. But what they never understood was that she could not be taken. She had seen men fight over her like gamblers fight over gold, each one believing they could tame her, each one broken by her refusal. The scars of their failures remained, not on her, but on them. She carried herself as if untouched by the violence of their attempts. That was what unsettled them most, and now here he stood, the scarred Apache. He was not like the others who came swaggering with confidence or smiling with easy charm. His presence was heavier, his silence more dangerous than any boast. The stories whispered about him had traveled far, how he had fought in battles where men twice his number fell, how he had been hunted and yet never caught, how he had turned his back on every path that men expected him to follow. The scar on his face was not the only one he carried. It was said his body was a map of pain, each mark telling of fights survived, betrayals endured, losses he never spoke of. He had come into town without asking permission, without greeting, without explaining. He had ridden in as if he belonged to no law but his own, and that unsettled those who lived by fences and rules. The sheriff had watched him from the doorway of his office, hand hovering near the iron on his hip. But even he had not dared step between the Apache and the woman. Some men held power by law, others by money, and some by fear. But this man, scarred and silent, carried something older, something heavier. The woman studied him, as if measuring the weight of his soul. She had grown up among whispers of raids and battles, of soldiers marching into the desert and never returning. She knew the strength of those who lived by the land rather than by the towns. Yet there was something more in this man. His eyes held the desert itself, vast and endless, with secrets buried deep under shifting sands. She recognized the same thing in him that lived inside her refusal to bow, even when the world demanded it. Still, she would not yield, not even to one like him. She stepped closer, her voice steady, though the heat pressed hard against her chest. "If you came looking for a prize," she said, her tone sharp as flint, striking steel, "you will leave with nothing." Her words carried through the crowd, but the Apache did not flinch. He did not smile, did not frown. He stood as steady as stone, the scar across his cheek catching the glare of the sun. Then, slowly, he answered, his voice deep and low, as if pulled from the earth itself. "I did not come for a prize." The words hung in the air, heavy and confusing. Some of the townsfolk shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. If not for a prize, then for what? Why had he come here? Riding into town with the weight of war on his shoulders and the fire of something unknown in his eyes. She narrowed her gaze, searching his face for a lie, but found none. There was truth in his voice, though it was a truth she could not yet read. The silence between them deepened, not with comfort but with the crackle of something dangerous. Like dry brush waiting for a spark, the crowd began to drift. Though slowly, afraid to turn their backs on the pair, the saloon keeper slipped inside, muttering that this would not end clean. A few gamblers followed, hoping to place bets on what might unfold. Mothers pulled their children away, and old ranch hands stayed rooted in place, drawn by the pull of history being written in dust. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his voice carrying more caution than command. "Whatever this is," he said, "let it be known we don't want blood on our streets." His eyes darted between the woman and the Apache, but neither gave him a glance. The law had no voice here. The moment was theirs. The Apache's gaze never left her. "You stand alone," he said quietly. because none are strong enough to stand with you." Her jaw tightened, though her heart gave the faintest flicker at his words. She had heard men boast of strength before, had heard them promise to match her fire, and each one had been proven false. Yet something in his voice carried no boast, no promise, only truth. Still, she would not show weakness. "Better alone than bound," she replied, her tone like a blade unsheathed, the faintest hint of something respect. Perhaps her challenge flashed in his scarred eyes. He gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. He understood her words, as if he had lived them himself. Night crept near as the sun lowered, throwing long shadows across the street. The tension did not fade. If anything, it deepened, stretching tighter as the sky burned orange and red. Lanterns lit one by one in doorways, their glow soft against the growing dark. But still the two stood facing each other, caught in a battle that required no weapons. Somewhere beyond the town, a coyote howled, and the sound carried through the air like an omen. The woman's heart quickened, though she did not show it. The Apache remained still, his presence unshaken. He was like the desert stone, immovable. But she wondered what storms had shaped him. What fires had burned to leave the scar on his face and the shadows in his eyes. And she wondered why he had chosen her. The town could feel it, too, that whatever had begun in that street was not ending tonight. The story between them was only just opening, like a wound that had yet to bleed. Like thunderclouds gathering before the first strike of lightning, as the last light of day sank into the horizon, the Apache finally turned his head, looking past her toward the wide stretch of desert beyond the town. He said nothing, but the gesture alone carried weight. It was as if he was reminding her, reminding all of them, that the desert watched and waited, that whatever happened next would not be settled by men in a saloon or by whispers in the street. The woman followed his gaze for a brief moment, then looked back at him, her eyes narrowing again. She would not ask him why he had come. She would not give him the satisfaction. But deep inside, beneath the steel of her pride, question burned hotter than the desert sun. What had drawn him to her, the woman no one dared to claim? The night swallowed the town, and though the people drifted back to their homes, no one slept easy. Behind closed doors, they whispered about the scarred Apache and the untamable woman, about the fire that had sparked between them. Some prayed it would pass like a storm rolling through. Others feared it would consume them all. But in the quiet, under the blanket of stars, the two of them remained awake, their thoughts circling like wolves in the dark. The desert had seen many stories before, but this one was only beginning, and it promised to be unlike any other. The air was heavy with things unsaid, and the night itself seemed to wait for the dawn to decide whether it would bring peace or ruin. The morning sun rose over the town with a pale light, casting long shadows across the worn boards of the main street. The dust that had been stirred the day before still lingered in the air, as if the ground itself remembered what had passed. The townsfolk emerged slowly from their homes and shops, whispering to one another in hushed tones. No one forgot the way the scarred Apache had faced the untamable woman in the center of town, nor the silence that had stretched between them. It was a silence heavier than any gunshot, a silence that promised more to come. The woman rose before dawn. She always did, walking to the edge of town where the desert began. She breathed in the dry air and felt the wind move across her skin. Out here, she did not need to play a part. Out here, she could stand as herself, not as a figure to be feared or admired. But her thoughts refused to settle. The Apache's words still lingered in her mind, spoken in that deep, steady tone that seemed to come from a place she could not touch. He had said he did not come for a prize. She had heard many men say many things, and most of them had meant less than the dust beneath her feet. Yet there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, something that told her he carried a truth she was not ready to face. Back in town, the Apache was not idle. He did not linger in the saloon or sit at the card tables. Instead, he walked the edges of the streets, his eyes scanning the town like a hunter studying new ground. The blacksmith watched him carefully. Hammer paused in midair, while the preacher muttered prayers under his breath. The shopkeeper tried to keep his hands steady as he weighed flour for a customer. Though his gaze flicked constantly, toward the tall figure moving with quiet purpose. The Apache did not speak much, but his presence alone stirred something deep in the hearts of those who lived there. Some felt unease, some felt fear, a few felt something closer to respect. The sheriff tried to convince himself that he still held the reins of order. He told himself that law was stronger than rumor, that his badge was more powerful than scars and silence. But when he looked into the Apache's eyes, he felt a weight pressing against his chest, a reminder that there were forces the law could not tame. He thought of confronting the man, of asking his purpose outright, but the words never left his throat. Something inside him knew that such a move might spark a fire too large to put out by midday, and the town seemed caught between two worlds. On one side, life moved on as usual. Horses watered at the trough. Women carried baskets of goods. Children played in the dust. On the other, there was a waiting, a tension like a drawn bowstring. At the center of it all stood the untamable woman, as steady and unyielding as ever. She ignored the whispers that followed her, ignored the stares. But she could not ignore the way her heart tightened each time she caught sight of the Apache. She did not want to admit it, but his presence was shifting something inside her, stirring a conflict she could not name. It was not only between them that conflict brewed. Among the townsfolk, division spread. Some believed the Apache meant harm, that he had come to claim her by force, or to bring ruin upon them all. Others believed he was something else entirely, perhaps a shield, perhaps a test. At the saloon, men argued over whiskey, their voices sharp and loud. "He'll bring trouble," one rancher spat, slamming his glass down. "Mark my words, he'll light this town up like kindling." Another man shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I saw the way he looked at her. That wasn't greed. That wasn't conquest. It was something else." The woman's own allies were torn as well. A young boy who often ran errands for her believed the Apache might protect her. An older widow who had known her since childhood warned her to stay away, fearing nothing but ruin could come from a man with such scars. And though she listened to none of them, their voices echoed in her mind, clashing with her own thoughts. One evening, she found herself face to face with him again. It was not in the middle of the street this time, but at the well where the water was drawn. The setting sun painted the world in shades of fire and ash. She lowered her bucket and pulled it up, her arm steady, despite the weight. When she turned, he was standing there, watching quietly. "You follow me?" she said, her tone sharp. "No," he replied calmly. "I watch." Her eyes narrowed. "And what is it you see?" For a long moment, he did not answer. Then, with the same quiet weight as before, he said, "I see someone who carries chains without letting them bind her." His words struck her harder than any gunshot. She wanted to argue, to laugh at him, to dismiss him as another man who thought he understood her, but the truth of it cut too deep. She turned away, her grip on the bucket tight enough to make her knuckles pale. The conflict between them was not of guns or fists, but of something deeper, something neither could name. And yet around them, danger stirred in other forms. The ranchers who lived on the outskirts had grown restless. They feared the Apache's presence would draw others, feared raids and fire, and they whispered of taking matters into their own hands. Meanwhile, a group of gamblers in the saloon, smelling opportunity, began to stir trouble by placing wagers not only on cards, but on what might happen between the Apache and the woman. Even the sheriff, who had sworn to keep order, found himself tangled in the conflict. He felt pressure from the townsfolk to act, to send the Apache away. Yet some inner voice warned him that driving the man out might bring worse consequences. He wrestled with his own doubts at night, his badge feeling heavier than it ever had before. The woman lay awake under the stars, her mind chasing questions she did not want to answer. Why had he chosen her? Why did his silence feel heavier than the shouting of other men? Why, when she looked into his scarred face, did she feel not only challenge but something else, something she could not define? The Apache, for his part, kept his distance, though always near enough to be seen. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a weight that lodged in the hearts of those who heard them. He was not reckless, nor boastful, and that unsettled men more than if he had been. He was a storm waiting to break, and no one could tell whether he would bring rain for the fields or fire for the town. Days passed, and the tension only deepened. Subplots wove themselves into the larger conflict like threads in a rough blanket. The ranchers plotted, the gamblers stirred. The sheriff wrestled with fear, and the woman fought a battle within her own soul. And at the center of it all stood the scarred Apache, watching, waiting. His presence a question none could answer. The desert nights grew colder, and the people prayed for clarity, but clarity never came. The conflict was not ready to be resolved. Not yet. The story was still building, each moment heavier than the last, each step leading closer to something the town could not yet see. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone knew. The true storm had not yet come. It lingered on the horizon, waiting for the right spark, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. The desert had its own way of holding secrets. It swallowed sound, carried whispers on the wind, and buried truth beneath the shifting sand. The town sat at its edge like a fragile outpost clinging to survival. But even the strongest walls could not hold back the storm that was gathering. Each day, the presence of the scarred Apache grew heavier. And each night, the untamable woman felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her spirit. The people moved about their business with unease, as if every step might set off a spark. They spoke in low voices, argued in corners, and kept glancing over their shoulders. The tension was no longer just between the Apache and the woman. It had seeped into every crack of the town, turning the simplest act into something dangerous. The gamblers were the first to take advantage. They sat in the saloon, dealing cards with restless hands, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Bets were laid not just on poker games, but on whether the Apache would stay or go, whether the woman would stand or yield. Men drank too much, voices rose, and the saloon's floorboards groaned under the weight of growing trouble. More than once, knives flashed under the lamps. But each time someone backed away, muttering about saving blood for the real fight that was surely coming. The ranchers were worse. They gathered outside of town at night, their fires glowing like angry stars against the dark. They muttered about the danger of letting an Apache walk free among them, scarred or not. They spoke of raids, of cattle theft, of women carried off into the desert. Old fears were dragged back into the light, twisted into threats. They convinced themselves that if they did not act, they would all pay the price. Their anger grew into a plan, though none dared say it too loud in the daylight. But the whispers carried, and soon the town knew that men with rifles were watching, waiting for a reason to strike. The sheriff felt the noose tightening around his neck. Each day, he heard demands from both sides. Some begged him to drive the Apache out, to put the town first, to protect them from the storm they were certain was coming. Others told him to wait, to let the desert play its hand. But the lawman knew better than most how fragile peace could be. His hands shook more now when he reached for his coffee. At night he stared at the ceiling, listening for the sound of hooves that might mean the end. He wanted to confront the woman, to ask her to step back, to stop fueling the fire. But he also knew she would not listen, and perhaps she should not. She had always been her own law, and it was part of what made the people both fear and respect her. The woman herself felt the battle rising not just outside, but inside. She had faced many men before, some with words, some with fists, some with bullets. She had faced them all and walked away untouched. Yet the scarred Apache was different. He had not raised his hand against her, had not spoken words of possession, yet his very presence challenged her. Each glance, each silence between them, seemed to dig deeper under her skin. She hated that he unsettled her. She hated that she could not read him like she could others. And most of all, she hated that part of her wanted too. One evening, she found herself drawn again to the well. The moon hung heavy, silvering the world in cold light. She leaned against the stones, her heart heavy with thoughts she could not name. And then she heard him. The steady sound of boots on dirt, slow and certain. She did not turn as he approached, but she felt him near. "You stirred the town," she said finally, her voice low. "I stir nothing," he answered. "They stir themselves." She turned then, her eyes flashing in the moonlight. "And what of me? Do I stir myself, or is that your doing?" He held her gaze without flinching. "You stir because you are not meant to be still." Her breath caught, though she did not want it to. She stepped closer, anger and something else burning together. "Do not speak as if you know me." But his silence after that was more cutting than any words. It told her he knew something, perhaps not all, but enough to unsettle her in ways she had never been before. That night she could not sleep. She walked the desert edge, her footsteps silent in the sand. The stars stretched endless above her, and the coyotes cried out in the distance. She thought of the ranchers plotting with their rifles, of the gamblers drinking away their fear, of the sheriff sweating under the weight of his badge. And always, her mind circled back to him, the scarred Apache, the man who did not come for a prize, but for something deeper. She wondered if he even knew himself why he was here. By dawn, the trouble that had been building began to boil over. A fight broke out in the saloon, fists pounding against wood and glass shattering under boots. It started over cards, but it ended with someone shouting the Apache's name, and suddenly the whole room was split. Some cursed his presence, some defended it, and when the sheriff tried to step in, he found himself nearly trampled. The fight spilled into the street, drawing a crowd that shouted and argued, their fear turning into rage. The woman pushed through the crowd, her eyes blazing. She stood in the middle of the chaos, her voice rising above them all. "Enough," she commanded, and for a moment silence fell. But then, from the edge of the street, the ranchers appeared, rifles in hand. Their leader's face twisted with anger. "This ends now," he declared. "We won't let him bring ruin to this town." His voice carried like a shot. The people gasped as the rifles glinted in the sun. The Apache stepped forward then, slow and steady. His presence alone parted the crowd, their fear of him outweighing their thirst for fight. He stood tall, scar catching the light, his eyes locked on the ranchers. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than their shouts. The standoff thickened, the air crackling with tension. The sheriff shouted for order, but his voice was lost in the storm. The woman's heart pounded as she looked from the rifles to the Apache, from the townsfolk to the desert beyond. Every choice she had ever made seemed to lead to this moment. She had sworn never to be claimed, never to yield, but she could see now that this conflict was no longer just about her. It was about the whole town, about the clash between fear and defiance, between freedom and control. And she stood in the middle, bound to the man who had brought it to a breaking point simply by being who he was. The ranchers raised their rifles higher, and the townsfolk gasped. The gamblers whispered bets under their breath, as if even now profit could be made from blood. The sheriff's hand shook on his gun, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. And through it all, the Apache remained steady, unflinching, his scarred face unreadable. The woman stepped forward, her body tense as a drawn bow. She knew one wrong word, one wrong move, could set the world aflame. The desert wind kicked up dust, swirling around them, stinging eyes and biting skin. The moment stretched, long and unbearable, like the seconds before lightning strikes, and still no one moved. The town held its breath, waiting for the first spark. Every heart pounded with the same unspoken thought. The storm had come now. No one could stop it now. The air was so still that it felt as though even the desert itself held its breath. Dust swirled lazily between the ranchers' raised rifles and the scarred Apache standing silent in the center of the street. The woman felt the pull of every gaze fixed on her, though her eyes stayed locked on him. She saw no fear in his face, no trembling in his hands, only a calm that seemed impossible against the threat of bullets. That calm was its own kind of weapon, and it unsettled everyone more than any show of rage could have. The rifles did not lower, though hands began to sweat around their grips. The men wanted a reason, any reason, to release the storm they had carried inside for so long. But the Apache gave them nothing. He did not threaten, did not move. He stood like stone, scar gleaming in the harsh sun, waiting for them to decide who they truly were. The sheriff finally found his voice, though it cracked under the weight of fear. "Put those rifles down," he called, his hand shaking over the iron at his hip. This isn't the way, but the words carried little force. The rancher's leader spat into the dust, his finger twitching near the trigger. "Then what is the way?" he demanded. His eyes burned with anger, though beneath it there was something else, something closer to fear. He needed an enemy to justify it. And the Apache was the perfect shadow for that fear to cling to. The woman stepped between them. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of the moment, but her voice came sharp and strong. "This fight isn't about him," she declared, her words cutting through the charged silence. "This is about fear. Yours. You look at him, and you see what you don't understand. So you point rifles and call it justice." Her words struck the ranchers like stones. Some shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the ground. Others tightened their grips, willing to hear the truth in what she said. The Apache's eyes remained on her, steady and unwavering. She could feel the weight of his silence pressing against her, as though he stood not only behind her, but within her, lending her strength she did not ask for yet could not deny. The rancher's leader shook his head, his jaw clenching. "And what of you?" he said, his voice bitter. "You've stirred this town into ruin, same as him. You let no man claim you, and now you bring a wolf to our doors. We will not let the two of you burn this place down." His words drew murmurs from the crowd, but they did not carry the conviction he hoped for. Fear was a fragile foundation, and cracks were beginning to show. The woman lifted her chin, her eyes blazing. "I've never burned anything down," she said, her tone low but fierce. "I've only refused to bow. If you call that ruin, then perhaps the ruin is already in you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Dust whirled around them, stinging eyes and throats. The sun pressed down with merciless heat. Then, slowly, one of the ranchers lowered his rifle. His hands shook as he stepped back, muttering under his breath. Another followed, then another. The leader cursed them, but his voice cracked, and in the end, he too lowered his weapon. Though his glare burned with a promise that this was not forgiveness, the crowd began to break apart. Murmurs rising like restless wind. The sheriff let out a long breath, shoulders sagging with relief. The gamblers slipped back into the saloon, muttering about lost bets. Mothers pulled their children close, and ranchers drifted back toward the edge of town, their pride stinging more than their fear. The storm had not spilled blood, but it had left its mark. The Apache stood silent still, his dark eyes watching as the dust settled. The woman turned to him, her heart pounding. "Why did you not fight them?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. His answer came slow, each word heavy with meaning. "Because they were not my fight, yours." Her breath caught at the truth of it. He had not come to take her, nor to save her. He had come to stand where no one else dared, to remind her that strength did not mean being alone. She had always believed no man could stand with her without trying to own her. Yet here he was, scarred and silent, refusing to take what was not his, refusing even to fight her battle for her. The sheriff approached, clearing his throat. "This town won't forget today," he said, his eyes darting nervously between the two. "And neither will I. But you've shown them something they needed to see." His voice carried both gratitude and unease. For he knew peace born from fear never lasted long. The days that followed were uneasy, yet quieter. The ranchers nursed their wounded pride, muttering but not daring to act again so soon. The gamblers turned their attention back to cards, though the shadow of what had nearly been hung heavy in the saloon. The townsfolk carried on, but every time the Apache walked the street, every time the woman lifted her chin, they remembered the storm they had seen and the silence that had broken it. For the woman, there was no going back to what had been before. She walked the desert edge with new eyes, seeing the land not only as her refuge but as a mirror. Like the desert, she could not be owned, could not be claimed. But she also could not deny the presence of another storm walking beside her. The Apache did not follow her, nor did he leave. He moved through the town like the wind, sometimes near, sometimes far, always present. And though they spoke little, the silence between them was no longer unbearable. It was alive, heavy with meaning, filled with something unspoken but undeniable. The sheriff, weary but wiser, found a strange peace in their presence. He no longer tried to control what could not be controlled. He learned to trust that some battles could be ended without bullets, that strength could be shown not only in force, but in refusal. The ranchers still grumbled, but their rifles stayed put, their courage tempered by the memory of the woman's voice cutting through their fear. As for the townsfolk, they carried away a story that would be told long after the dust of that day settled. They spoke of the untamable woman who faced down rifles without flinching, of the scarred Apache who stood silent and unbroken, of the storm that nearly consumed them all, but instead left them changed. Some told it with admiration, some with fear, but all remembered. The woman never softened, never yielded. She remained as she always was, fierce and free. But now, when she looked at the Apache, she did not see another man trying to break her. She saw a mirror of her own defiance, a reminder that strength could stand beside strength without chains, without cages. And though she never called him hers, and he never called her his, they carried something between them that was stronger than any claim. In time, the town settled into its old rhythms, but the memory of that day lingered like a scar across its history. It was a reminder of what fear could almost destroy, and of what courage could preserve. It was a story of freedom, of defiance, of two souls who met not to tame one another, but to prove that some fires burn brighter when left untamed, and when the desert winds howled at night. Carrying whispers through the streets, the people would close their shutters and murmur a single truth. No one dared to claim the untamable woman until the scarred Apache appeared, and even then she remained her own. The desert had held its secret, and in the end, it had given it back. The storm had passed, but its echo would never fade.